Knock, knock, howdy, folks. Hello from the Nashville skyline, and welcome to the Dr. Ben and Friends podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to putting the med in comedy. We're shining a big, bright spotlight on the everyday heroes of healthcare and comedy. We're filming in Nashville where the music's hot and the chicken's hotter. I'm your host, Dr. Ben, your friendly neighborhood board-certified orthopedic surgeon by day and stand-up comedian by night. I'm Nashville's favorite bone doctor turned joke doctor. Please welcome my guest, Adam, my first assistant in the operating room in the OR. He hands me instruments in surgery and still trusts me with sharp objects. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and let's give it up for Dr. Ben Sawyer, history professor, comedian, podcaster, and the only other Ben allowed on this show. Welcome, Dr. Ben Sawyer, Professor Sawyer.
It's great to be here. It's great to be here with another Dr. Ben. And I've told you this story before. When I found out there was another Dr. Ben who was a comic, I wasn't sure if that means we needed to battle to decide that there could be only one or if we'd be friends. And I'm very happy it was the second one. Very happy it's the second one.
Yes, that's right, folks. The Dr. Ben and Friends podcast prescribes 100% comedy with zero copay. Today, we're celebrating the real heroes and comics who dedicate themselves to keeping you safe and laughing. Thank you for joining us. All right, strap in, Nashville. We got an OR first assist and an American Soviet history expert in the same room. This is either going to be brilliant or a medical emergency. Heads up, folks. The Dr. Ben and Friends podcast is your weekly dose of laughs and stories. We celebrate healthcare heroes and pro comics. This is infotainment. Think popcorn, not prescriptions or medical advice. If you're feeling funky, see your medical professional. Your health, that's on you. We'll stick to the punchlines. All right, folks, you're in for a treat today. We have Professor Ben Sawyer, professor by day, comedian by night, and podcast rock star. He champions American history, 20th century Russian history, and history of economic systems. For our listeners, Professor Ben likes capitalism and communism topics and how the U.S. and Soviet Union saw each other during the Cold War. Welcome, Professor Ben.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad you threw the word in topics there at the end because otherwise, I'd be like, he likes capitalism and communism. Like, let's sort that out.
I thought I might get on some sort of list.
No, I'm very interested in them. Also, Ben, Dr. Ben, could I say something here?
Please do.
When you introduced the show, you said that you have heroes and comics.
Right.
I mean, what, just because I don't save people's lives?
You're a hero, too.
Okay, thank you so much. Just wanted to qualify that for the people who are listening.
Healthcare hero. I should have qualified. Healthcare hero.
Healthcare heroes.
You are a hero.
They're to deal with all the people who've been doing comedy for a long time and need some help.
All right. Dr. Ben's going to provide some expert assistance here as we have a healthcare hero with us today, a first assistant in the operating room, Adam. All right, Professor Ben, do you have any nicknames that you've heard about first assistants or Adam here?
Nicknames.
Such as...
like what, you mean like the things you were saying about him before he got here? I didn't think you wanted me to say them in front of him.
Well, some have called him the clamp champ, the blade buddy, suture sidekick, hemostat hero.
So what, you hand weapons, sorry, not weapons, but...
instruments.
Instruments, there we go, instruments.
Instruments, well, those are the scrub techs usually. Sometimes I do fill that role.
So Adam, tell us, what is a first assistant? What do you actually do? What is a first assistant?
Yeah, first assistant is something probably no one knows exists half the time, just like most healthcare jobs. I help the team get ready for surgery. I support the surgical tech, the circulator, the nurse in the room. I help with positioning the patient, make sure that they're in a safe and comfortable position for surgery. And then I'm the one that stands on the opposite side of the doctor and assists him while whatever he needs. Basically, I'm an extra pair of hands, whether that's holding retractors, helping stop bleeding, or closing you up at the end.
Okay, for me, when you said helping stop bleeding, I imagine that there's a huge gash and Dr. Ben is trying to stop it with two hands, but his two hands aren't long enough. So he goes, Adam, give me a hand. And then you put it on top and you guys, can we count to 10? Is that what you do?
Sometimes, like if there's a vessel bleeding or something, honestly, digital
Pressure
is kind of one of the most effective ways to stop the bleeding. But usually they're going to need to tie that off or do something that's going to require both of their hands. So it's kind of hard to do by themselves sometimes.
It's incredible. This is going to be my problem is I'm going to stop wanting to be funny and just listen to this. I mean, it's just fascinating to me. I mean, yeah.
Sometimes we have to ligate or suture off a vessel, use electrocautery and buzz it to keep it from bleeding. So unfortunately, I don't have 4 hands. So
yeah, and sometimes I have to have 3 or 4, but it doesn't always work out that way.
So Adam, tell us about the training and certification process as a certified first assistant. What does that training like? Is that...
my role, there's a couple of different ways kind of to get there. The most common role, the path I took, usually they become a surgical tech or a certified surgical tech at some point. I was a scrub tech for 6-7 years, about there. And then I went to assisting school. And so that's usually another year or sometimes 2 years, depending on the school you go to. You have to get clinical cases, hours, that sort of thing. So typically, they don't want you to go to school for that until you've been working for 2-3 years, and you're a really good surgical tech, ideally. And then it takes a couple of years just to become surgical tech. So it's about 5-6 years of training.
It's the kind of thing where you kind of have to prove yourself first.
Yeah, ideally, yeah.
So most of them start off as a scrub tech or technologist.
Typically, there are RNFAs, nurses that are RNs that go through a separate school, FAs. Some of them scrubs as well. Some of them weren't. And then also in the OR, PAs and nurse practitioners sometimes fill the same role that we do in the room. They can do other things in the clinic, obviously, that I can't do. But.
So what is a scrub tech that you were described? How's that different from the first assist? What's a scrub tech in the OR?
I was going to ask that question, but I didn't want to sound so dumb after being so ignorantly excited about this.
Yeah. So the scrub tech is basically responsible for anything sterile in the room. Their main job is to establish and maintain the sterile field to prevent any sort of infections or anything from the surgery. So they make sure that we have all the instruments we need, whatever sort of specialty equipment that the surgeon's going to need, because every surgery is different, every specialty is different, every patient's different. So they make sure that everything is ready, and then they pass the instruments back and forth to myself and the surgeon, as we go. And sometimes they can come up, and sometimes we need an extra hand. They help us as well.
So how many people are in that room?
So the typical OR team, standard OR team, at least in this area, you're going to have someone to put them to sleep, so an anesthesiologist or a CRNA. You're going to have the doctor, the surgeon, obviously. You're going to have a nurse. You have to have a nurse legally to circulate the case, and they're the non-sterile team member. If we need anything during the case, they run and get that, or something goes a different way, like, hey, I need an extra instrument, or I need a new piece of equipment or something.
And they play DJ.
And yes,
importantly, they're in charge of the music.
Usually,
very important role.
The DJ is a very important role of the circulator.
Okay. They play the music. Okay, keep going.
And then yes, of course, you have the scrub tech, and then you have myself. So a standard OR team is 4 or 5 people typically.
So at the surgical field, sterile surgical field, there's a
3 people,
scrub
usually,
technologist, first assistant, and the surgeon.
So what's your playlist? You guys fight about that? I know this isn't my show, but I mean, look, I'm the one who knows nothing about what you're doing.
So some surgeons are very particular about what playlist they like.
Some want the room very quiet.
Yeah, some want it very quiet. Some want, they come in, they want classic rock, or they want the hair bands, or you work with people long enough, you kind of know what they like. Some of them, they just don't care. They like having, just some music in the, in the background, right? A lot of times it's like the staff, we just sort of, what we're in the mood for, sort of thing.
I actually have a list of songs that are banned from my operating room during surgery.
Well, there are some standard songs that we do not play in the
Dust
OR.
in the Wind, another one, Bites the Dust, Highway to Hell, Stairway to Heaven, I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding. That song comes on.
We skip these if they come up.
Yeah.
They're not just... we're not superstitious in surgery, but we're a little stitious.
Little stitious.
Yeah.
So I actually have songs that are banned from...
Yeah, I worked with a surgeon once. He didn't allow AC/DC in his room because one time the AC/DC was playing, and he'd had a rough case basically, and he blamed the AC/DC. So no AC/DC ever again.
Wow.
You never know. Some doctors love country. Some doctors, it's just kind of whatever. They've actually done studies on this. Music in the OR doesn't really matter what it is, but I'm trying to remember if it was the University of Maryland or where they did the study. But music actually makes the surgeons more accurate with their cuts. It improves their surgical times, outcomes. Like, oddly enough, there's a separate part of our brain, right, that processes only music. So that might have something to do with it. But
this is amazing because I was a carpenter for years, right? And I still build things. And when I've got to do like detailed stuff, I listen to Muddy Waters. Like I just go, I need to listen to Muddy Waters while I'm doing this woodworking.
I can see that.
It's like very different stakes. but I get it.
Yeah. Because sometimes it's Taylor Swift, I don't know.
One surgeon was, this is a true story, one surgeon was actually blaring Viking death metal, like top 10 out of 10. It was like, echoes of eternity, pluck the strings of destiny, Valhalla's calling me. And it was right next to the C-section room. And it was making the expectant mothers nervous.
I could see that.
And they're like, yo, Ragnar, could you turn that down? It was making... So you have to be a little sensitive to your neighbors.
Yeah, obviously. And it never gets like, it's not like a club, you know what I mean? And I sometimes, like when the patients are going to sleep, I'll play classical music or relax. Because some people come in, they're very nervous. We do this every day, but the person on the table, it might be the worst day of their life. I don't know, right? But usually I love my job because typically someone comes in and something is broken or something's hurting them and we fix it. And they leave better than they came in. So it's a high stress, high reward type of job. I mean, doing that multiple times a day, every day, it's probably a pretty big dopamine hit, I would imagine.
Yeah, I don't like it completely quiet, but I don't want like nervous energy of like the Viking death metal.
Yeah, that's a little much.
And then I had a Gen Zer circulating nurse, the DJ, and she asked what kind of music I wanted to listen to. And so I said classic rock. And so she's Gen Zer. She said, oh, like Nickelback and Linkin Park, Foo Fighters. Well, I do love them. I wasn't thinking more.
Yeah.
But classic rock has changed over the years. As
my college
the definition.
students are wearing Deftone shirts.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, they're back into my music. And it occurred to me that was like whenever we were in college and wore Led Zeppelin shirts.
Right. Same thing, exactly. Well, Mr. Adam, so what drew you to become a first assist? Like what?
Like from like a scrub tech in the first place, or from becoming a scrub tech?
Yeah, to become a scrub tech and then to go on to become a first assist. Can you tell us about that journey?
When we moved down here, I had lived in Canada. My wife's from Canada, and it was the middle of the economic turn down. And I used to do like business consulting. I used to do a lot of like supply chain management, cost analysis, that sort of stuff. And it was just hard to get work at the time, and I just wanted to do something different. I liked working with my hands, I liked working outside. I thought, maybe I'd become a nurse, and I didn't even know, scrub tech existed. I didn't know what you did in the OR really, and it just sort of looking at courses at various schools and just came up, and I said that sounds interesting, and so I applied and interviewed. The programs are very competitive. I think we had over 100 applicants the year I was in there, and they had like 18 people they chose for the program.
Wow.
So you came, she said, from cost analysis, you saying?
Mm-hmm.
How was that application? I mean, because if you got 100 people, right? And surely you've got people that have, do you think, because this is what I work with on my students a lot of times for like Fulbright applications and stuff. And I tell them it's really about telling a story where your story is, when people look at your application, they shouldn't be like they're giving you something. They see you following a path. And instead of giving you something, they're merely getting out of the way and handing it to you as you go past.
Right.
So was there a lot of narrative in that when you wrote your application, or what?
A little bit. I mean, because I've done a number of things in my life, and I, like I said, I'm not really medically related, but my family, we had a business for many years ago, and so we used to do a lot of stuff like in the anti-aging, sector with, I'd go to a lot of doctors' conferences and things. So I had some sort of knowledge of that, but. I think what really helped me was that like they're used to getting a lot of applicants that were like, fresh out of high school, fresh out of college. And I was like late 20s at the time. And so, a little more put together. I was, very excited about it. It was just something that, I don't know, it just immediately clicked with me, so, but yeah, it's definitely a big transition.
What was that interview like? Did they have like fake bleeders? And you had to stop the bleeding. What are you going to do?
No, I mean, okay. there's like tests you have to take, and it's more of just kind of making sure that you have the right feel for the personality of the type of person. Because look, it takes a different person to work in healthcare, and it takes an even different person to work in the OR. So managing stress obviously is part of it. We get some people, students, the first time they come in, the first time they see blood, they pass out, right? So, which you're not going to know that until you go to the OR. But I know my instructor, she would always send us to view an OR case within the first few weeks of school, so we kind of have an idea of if people were squeamish or whatnot.
Yeah, I feel like they almost need like a spotter for a first time in surgery, like just to make sure, because we have had people pass out.
Yeah, we tell people is just stand with your back to the wall so that if you fall, you won't fall forward, and don't touch anything sterile.
We don't like the bodies to hit the floor.
It's not preferred.
Right.
Although it would be convenient if they break a bone, we just roll them up there as soon as you get the last guy
That's
off.
right.
Oh, we got another one.
Next.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next. All right. So how do you handle the stress of the job? Do you use humor at all?
Yeah. If anyone that knows me, I probably overuse humor, I suppose. But I don't know. I just, I moved out when I was 16 years old. I've just kind of like, my whole life has been stress in one way or another, I suppose. So,
Survival.
Years of traumatic childhood probably just, prepared me for this career. It's just, one of those things. Like it's, in an emergency, whether it's in the ER or in the OR or anywhere, medicine, or even, someone were to have an accident on the side of the road, like panicking's not going to help.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to help that person. It's not going to help you.
And I imagine you have to work with a lot of different personalities
Yes.
of surgeons, and there's kind of like a stereotype a lot of times of kind of egomaniacs and.
There is, and I mean, I've met my fair share, but to be honest,
Really? Are any of them in the room?
Present
Don't
company.
name names, but if any of them are in the room, just
I'll just blink twice.
Okay, yeah.
Present company excluded.
But I will say I've been very lucky that I've worked with a lot of just really great surgeons that are like just genuinely good people, do good work, and are really great to work with. So that's not the case everywhere. I've been a lot of places. I've worked, for almost every, company in Nashville. So, but there are stereotypes, like the ortho bros or the meatheads, the plastics guys, they got the Under Armour shirt and,
Yeah, tell us about the stereotypes.
Yeah, there's a little stereotypes like that. And some of them kind of hold true, sort of.
Any other urologists and
Yeah, urologists, like I said, I've all the urologists I've worked with have been really great, but they don't flinch at anything, man. Like because they're working in, urine and such, right? So
the stream team,
the P Palace, the stream team.
Palace.
Yeah, we used to have shirts that said stream team. It's a urology tech back in the day. But sometimes the camera doesn't work. They take the camera off and they're just looking down the lens,
Whoa.
That's old school urology. Yeah.
Like looking down the lens,
That's
down the
into the bladder.
into the bladder.
Yeah. Okay.
To the urethra.
That's
Okay,
how,
good
that's
deal.
how they used to do it before they had, video equipment. So,
Yeah, I guess that makes
Yeah.
sense.
if something's not working, it's anything. If in surgery, if something's not going the way we want it to, a piece of equipment's not working, we just find a way around it. We figure,
MacGyver.
Yeah, sometimes, but for the most part, everything works great. But
Sterile duct
again,
tape.
every patient's anatomy is different. So, if you could do 1,000 gallbladders, you could do, 1,000 knee replacements, and they're not all going to be the same.
Hey, Dr. Ben, I've got a joke. Why can't your nose be 12 inches long?
Why can't it be?
Because then it would be a foot.
So, how has technology kind of changed surgery in your job?
Well,
I know with the robot that we have the Da Vinci, and so the first assist.
we have a lot of robotics now. That's been very popular the last 5-10 years, I think. Of course, if you go back to the 90s, everything used to be done open as far as like general cases, abdominal cases, and now a lot of it is done laparoscopic because it's minimally invasive. It's easier recovery, less trauma to the patient. But the robotics has really grown. I mean, I was a robotic coordinator for a few years at one point. There's a lot of robots around Nashville, and that's a little different because the surgeon is operating like from a console, so like they get to see everything 3D inside the body. Whereas like if you open somebody up and you're looking down into the body, sometimes you can't see quite as well. It's like you have a 3D 4K camera that's like an inch away. You can see everything. It's incredible.
Yeah, did you know that, Professor Ben? Like a lot of times for surgery, the surgeon's over in the corner, not in sterile, just looking at a screen, operating joysticks.
I knew something about this. I had a massive surgery like January before last to get rid of I had stage 3 colorectal cancer. And it was almost all gone. But because it was in my pelvis, they were like, and it was like not clear. They were like, look, you're young enough. We need to get it out. Turned into a 10-hour-long surgery with robots. But I definitely asked my surgeon a lot about it. And she was just amazed. Like, which I asked her the big difference between doing it with the robotic surgery and doing it, other ways. And she said for her, the big thing was that she can actually, with the robot, see the nerves.
Better visualization.
Right. And, there are all these like potential side effects that can happen if you're working in like the pelvic region. And she crushed it. Like I have like no,
Figuratively.
yeah. No,
Okay, good.
She cut,
Okay.
she got it out. And
Okay.
like, it's amazing to me that she did it, but explaining that. And then, when you're going in for any surgery, right, you go, here are the side effects of it. It's like, I haven't had any side effects from it at all. And it makes
Great.
sense. It's just because she said, I can visualize it. The big danger is if I cut a nerve in that area, right? That could be bad for you.
Well, much better visualization and less invasive.
There were procedures that we pretty much couldn't do 10, 20 years ago, or that were very difficult. They were done open, and the success rate was a lot lower. And now with robotics, they're done routinely at a much higher success rate.
Yeah, Adam, walk us and the listener through, like if a patient's coming in for a surgery, we'll say something more like a gallbladder. It's kind of coming into the operating room, and then what
the process is?
What the process is.
So I always try, sometimes I'll go like get the patients and bring them up.
Okay.
That's not typically us, but I always try to give them a good idea of like what the process is going to be like. Because I feel like
what is it like?
a lot of times the surgeons say, well, this procedure takes about an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes the family thinks like, all right, I'll see you back in an hour.
Right.
And it's like, well, we're going to get you from your room, or if, it's an outpatient surgery, you might be in like a pre-op bed. And then you'll come to like kind of a pre-surgery area. You talk to the doctor, you talk to the anesthesia doctor. They do a little pre-op there. So that can take, 30, 40 minutes.
Confirm what procedure you're
Mm-hmm.
having.
That's right. We go over all the details, make sure that we're doing everything correctly. We have the right person, all that. And then, once they're in the OR, they got to go to sleep, do the procedure, wake up, and then there's an amount of recovery time after the surgery. So it's like an hour-long surgery. You might be gone for 3 or 4 hours, and that's kind of routine, depending on, what you're getting done. So,
Yeah, the actual operative time isn't
right.
necessarily the...
Operative time is not necessarily patient time.
So we like to confirm the patient and the procedure and the correct operative site.
We always have, I'm sure people know, we just like anything else, we're very, very, strict about all that. We have a timeout, before anyone ever cuts on anyone to make sure that this is the right person, whether we're working on the right, the left side, what we're doing, why we're doing it, if they have any allergies, just all that pretty standard stuff nowadays.
I remember being on the other end of it. They asked me my name and birthday so many times. But I do want to give a shout out to Dr. Christine Bailey for saving my life. So,
wow. That's awesome. Hope she's listening.
yeah. If she's not, it's probably because she's saving somebody else's life. So roll on,
That's
Dr. Bailey.
So you had major bowel surgery.
Yeah.
That was
robots.
with robots.
Yeah. This is how I describe it. You were describing it far more eloquently. I just know robot arms went inside of me, removed the cancer, and I'm now a year and a half out and still totally clear.
Yeah, and I think it was in like the late 90s or early 2000s, I believe, where the military was actually developing the surgery robots, with the idea being they could have these robots, and like a surgeon could be, in Germany or something, and they could, help, at a forward operating base or something. But at the time, I don't believe the internet, capability was quite there. So when it came to, private use, it's like the doctor's, a few feet away, obviously.
I just imagine the military developing them and dropping surgery robots on another country, and they're like, "Oh no!" They're like, "All our appendixes have been taken out." It's routine surgery, but it really slowed us down when they invaded with men.
But in the future, maybe you'll just go in like a like a drone bay or something, and just do surgery halfway across the world or something.
That could happen.
Yeah.
I think they've done remote surgeries.
The military does. I know that.
Can you
other
imagine
countries
that?
they have. Yeah.
I mean, it would make sense, but also when you say it, drone surgery, I just imagine you just like, well, like I've been having my tonsils out, and then you hear the buzz, and you go, "All right, time to lay down and take these pills," and you wake up, and the drone flies away, and you get ice cream.
Well, one of the amazing things is like, so the robot that you probably had your surgery on, it'll have 3 instruments, up to 3 instruments that the doctor can control. Well, they can only control 2 at once. So like they might have one holding something and they're controlling the second one. So sometimes they can have a second surgeon helping with that 3rd instrument. And there have been cases where like they've done it remote.
Wow.
Someone can and I believe that's sort of where it's going. Is like maybe if a doctor's like, hey, I could use a second opinion or something, they could like pop in and say, oh yeah, that looks like this or that, it's incredible the way medicine's going.
It is incredible.
And then what's your role in that robotic surgery? If they're
So
as the first assistant?
Yeah, for like a general robot or something like that. Mostly the same. Once we're getting started, we put all of our laparoscopic ports in, the small portholes that the instruments go through into the body. And then once the doctor leaves and goes to the console to do the surgery, I'm sort of there to make sure everything goes smoothly from that point. So if there's any sort of issues with the robot itself, if we need to give him different instruments and different arms, or, make sure that everything's just kind of keep it copacetic sort of thing.
And after the case, you'd say "Domo arigato."
I have said that a time or two. Yeah.
You high five the rib arm when it comes out. It's like, great job,
Great
buddy.
job.
I don't know. That could lead to you getting hurt. I'm not sure. I don't know. They look quite strong. We usually name
imagine
them.
the bits you put on the end of it, like different, like ends of an auger or something like that.
God, they're all different surgical instruments of different shapes. But yeah, kind of.
Yeah, what are those instruments?
So there's usually, you have graspers, you have scissors, you have cautery for hemostasis, controlling the blood. We have, clips for ligating, blood vessels. We have staple,
So you would have to change those out probably, right?
Oh, yeah.
Arm comes
Yeah,
out,
yeah.
you change it, and then
Mhm.
goes back in.
Yeah, so if you're doing like something, thoracic, for instance, they might take like a wedge of your lungs. That might take 10, 15 staple loads going up the lung. And so that's each time you're swapping that out.
Oh.
Is there a bottle opener too? Like when you're done, you're just like, we need some wine. And it comes out for you.
That's back at home.
Corkscrew.
Yeah.
The robotic corkscrew.
Toothpick. It's just a Swiss Army knife from like 1987 on the end of
Well,
the
one of
arm.
the ways they train the doctors actually when they're learning on these the general surgery robots is like they have like a fake abdomen basically, and they'll put like fruit or they might put like a grape in there, and they have them like try to peel the grape.
It's amazing how precise those can be, and they can do that.
Yeah.
It's
It's
supposed to be funny, but I'm just flabbergasted.
No,
Like-
please, be funny. Do you think they'll take our jobs someday?
This is a real question with AI and robotics that's coming out lately, and I hope not. I think that we're a ways away from them actually being capable to do that, despite what some people in the tech industry are saying. But also, when you show up to the hospital, do you want a robot nurse coming bedside? Like, you know what I'm saying? Do you want a robot doctor to talk to? Like, you want to know that there are, if there's robotics that obviously can help us do our job better, great. But, you want an actual human touch, I would think. I remember during COVID when they brought out, I had to go to the ER for something, and they brought out a iPad like on a
Stand,
wheel. Yeah,
yeah.
like to do all the registration, talk to the nurse and stuff. And I'm like, where are you? Like, and there's just no one in the room with me. It's weird.
I don't know. I prefer self-checkout at the store. Does that as opposed to making small talk with them?
Yeah. I both
You're
prefer
like, how
that
much
and
of
don't
these
prefer
peeled
that.
grapes
but-
I've got here?
That's right. Oh,
Like
last time I was-
self-checkout's always judging me.
I know. Last time she said strip down facing me. Before I realized she was talking about the credit card, it was too late. So
I will say a surprisingly large percentage of times that goes wait for help. And I was like, I didn't ask for any help. And then they have to review a video of what I was doing. Apparently I'm moving natural to the robots.
Yeah, it's
when I'm
because like
checking
the AI thinks you're stealing something. And there's been cases
At the grocery
lately
store?
of- yeah, the grocery store.
I'd come back over. They'd just be like randomly, like at the end, it's just like, wait for help. And I'm like, huh? And then somebody has to, and they show the video of me, I guess not moving as they would think I should move.
They
as
think
I
it's
scan something and
unorthodox.
Put it in a bag.
I think some stores are getting away from it again because people were for theft.
Well, the
It's
theft
easy
is
to-
up, and now
yeah.
the stores have actually, some of them have been like sending you a thing 3 months later in the mail and say, hey, you stole from us, come to court. And you're like, no, I didn't. And
Oh,
maybe
really?
you accidentally forgot to swipe something, or maybe the AI just got it wrong. But
It's a great way to
Um,
build a customer base. Great way
right.
to build.
yeah, I'm kind of like self-checkout to me is like starting to seem a little scary with all the AI and stuff. I'd rather just talk to a person now,
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
even though it is
work
same
that
for
you guys-
healthcare?
more
Yeah, the
convenient.
work that you guys do, right? When I went into this surgery, like when I came in with cancer, I will tell you a large portion of what made me feel good about what was going through was knowing the people that I was working with were professionals. They were invested in it. They cared. And this was their life's work. And I knew going in, there's a potential, like a small percentage you could die on the operating table. Okay, that's a statistical, possibility, right? They're like a small. But I also knew that the person that was doing the surgery cared. And I knew going into that, I told my wife, I said, whatever happens, we know we got the best person who cares about us. And I don't know how you go home if something terrible happens and you go, the programming was bad versus we know this person
Right.
was doing everything they could. I just sleep better knowing the person cared enough when they were doing the surgery. You know what I'm saying?
Because at the end of the day, our directive, our job is taking care of that patient. Like, I'm here to support the team, I'm here to support the surgeon, all that. But the number one priority is making sure that the patient comes out of that surgery safe and we've done everything proper. So,
And the robot doesn't care? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
who knows what their directives are.
Yeah, I don't know. I've chatted a little bit with Claude. It's very peculiar. It's very standoffish whenever you start
Okay.
asking it questions about what it wants, you know.
You're listening to
The Dr. Ben
And Friends
Podcast.
All right, thanks, team. Now it's time for Common Sense Healthcare ads. This episode of the Dr. Ben and Friends podcast is brought to you by Giggle Gauze. Pain got you down? Meet Giggle Gauze, the bandage that tells jokes every time you change it, because healing should come with laughs. May cause spontaneous giggles and random snorts. Side effects include better mood and weird looks from your nurse. Use code Dr. Ben for 23% off at checkout of Giggle Gauze. Mr. Adam, do you remember a moment, or can you walk us through when there was something specific in surgery where you kind of had to step in and be that healthcare hero? Maybe there was bleeding, you had to put an extra set of hands, or
Maybe Dr. Ben stopped to write some jokes down mid-surgery because he thought of something funny.
which
It's about every other week.
sterile marking pens that I could take some notes. There's a sterile marking pen.
Yeah, I got this. You write that one down,
Yeah.
sir.
I had an idea.
Nothing like that. One of my favorite cases that I used to do that we don't do them where I'm at currently, but I used to really love doing kidney transplants.
Oh, tell us about that.
So kidney transplants, sometimes, we'd have a donor in one room, we'd take the kidney out, and there'd be a donor in another room, or we'd have a kidney from, on ice, basically, from a donor somewhere else, and you have a certain amount of time to get that in. There's a lot of work. You got the patient open, you got to clear the area, get all the vessels ready for preparation. But the most satisfying part of that surgery is once the kidney goes in and you can see it's been sitting in ice and it's kind of cold and it's purple, and then you see it kind of come to life. And it starts to redden up, and the vessels start working. And yeah,
How cool would that be?
it's it's a great feeling. So we used to do those all the time.
That's amazing they can do that.
Yeah,
You have to hook up the blood flow, the arteries back to the
and I know. I've never done cardiac, but I know a lot of that's the same thing.
heart transplant.
They put people on the machine. They take the hearts out, and then once it starts pumping, I've heard the same thing from people that work in cardiac. It's just like, it's like a miracle, right?
Mhm.
And it's not something you get to see every day.
No, thank goodness, honestly. If I was going through kidneys every day, you know what I'm saying? I'd be like, I think you're doing something wrong. How long does it take to hook it up?
Those surgeries it's usually, depending on the patient and the doctor, it's several hours to kind of get to that point. They're long surgeries.
Well, I changed my hot water heater at my house.
So you could
a couple months
probably-
ago. It's
very
probably
similar.
pretty much the same thing, right? You just cut this one
Yeah,
off. cut this one
the
off,
tubes.
like-
It's just like an anatomy textbook. They're color coded. It's pretty easy.
I think it's probably a YouTube DIY.
Yeah,
we mixed
DIY
up the
video.
hot water and the cold water. Now his blood's running backwards.
yeah. If you get in any trouble, you can just put the YouTube video on the wall, and it'll be fine. Yeah.
The idea that we get in here is like, let's find out behind the surgery. Well, we wheel them in, we read the paper, and then we immediately go to YouTube and type.
And a circulating nurse, can you go back 10 seconds?
That's right. Yes, I need you. Yeah, I need you to go back.
10 seconds.
Wait, 10 more. Oh, okay. Yeah, that was good. Pause it there.
They're like, ugh, not ads again. Can we please, at this hospital, pay for the breast subscription?
Yeah, you would think weuld have the ad-free YouTube here. No, we got to save money in healthcare.
Can we skip ad? We got a sleeping patient here. Skip ad.
Like, why was the bill for anesthesia like quadruple what it normally is? It's like,
Ads.
they're just getting greedy on YouTube.
Yeah.
$12 a month is a lot. So
But if it goes well, we could give a like and subscribe.
That's right. You got to comment, like, and subscribe, and
That's
make
right.
sure to hit the bell.
then everybody has to re-sterilize because everybody smashed that like button.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. I didn't used to believe in organ transplants, but I've since had a change of heart.
What?
Change of heart. Yes.
That's bad.
All right. Moving right along here.
Could you talk about any surgeries that maybe you've done that
Maybe
are
not.
common?
Drink
Oh.
To
and get on
Nashville
a
injuries?
Scooter, electric scooter.
Yeah, I was going to say lime scooter.
Yeah,
bug scooter.
a lot of scooter injuries. We used to have a lot of those. And there used to be like 20 different companies down here competing for the scooter space. It seems to have calmed down a little bit, thankfully. But we used to get a lot of people with ankles and stuff on the scooters, obviously. And then, it's like anything else. Anytime there's a snowstorm or ice storm around here, people aren't used to it. especially the ice. But everybody wants to go out. So, grandma breaks the hip, the cousin, breaks his ankle, and it's, weeks of the ice was here. And you're like, yep, it's the same story every time.
Have you ever seen anybody who fell off one of those party buses?
Possibly. I can neither confirm nor deny that.
Waiting to happen. What could go wrong?
What could go wrong when drunk people are hanging themselves over the edge of a
No
bar
seat
that's
belt.
roughly waist high?
Yeah, I think the injury rates there are probably higher than you would expect, walking on Broadway.
Are they actually propelling themselves with the pedals? Or is
the
that
pedals,
just for...
pedal
Oh, the
tires.
pedal ones. I've always
pedal.
wondered that.
Okay. Because they're pedaling. Are they actually...
I'm sure there's a motor.
Okay. So if everyone stops pedaling, they're still going to...
Well, because you got a bunch of drunk people. Fitness may not be their forte. And if they all just decide to stop pedaling, that probably wouldn't work out so well.
Unless you had one dude at the top with just huge quads.
He's just
huge
pulling.
calves. He goes,
He's got
you
a
guys want
protein
to drink?
shake.
I got this, man. You got this for about a mile. Then
Lance Armstrong's always like, how come you always invite me to your bachelor parties?
I guess if you're going to do the pedal bike, you got to bring one designated driver. He's the designated pedaler.
Lance.
Yeah.
Lance Armstrong,
That's right.
Lance Armstrong's constantly getting invited to bachelor parties in Nashville, and he's like, I wonder why. And every time he comes, it's the same reason.
Passing everybody.
He's like, can we just
That's
go on one
another
of the ones with a hot tub next time?
Lance is
whole thing
requesting
now.
that. Can we get the one pulled by the John Deere tractor next time?
That's right. I saw that one the other day.
Woo. That's funny. All right. All right, folks. Now it's time for healthcare product we wish existed.
This episode of the Dr. Ben and Friends podcast is brought to you by Two Step Scrub Socks. Nurses are legends. Grab Two Step Scrub Socks that never slide and come with built-in dance beats. Get your socks popping. Warning, may cause social ostracism or line dancing in the hospital.
Adam, thank you for the insight into the surgical first assistant. Now you have a history professor and a couple comedians here. You kind of know what I do at work. Do you have any questions for a history professor or the comedians? Any questions about comedy? Do you enjoy comedy?
Yeah, of course. I enjoy comedy. So do you do historical comedy?
Well, history tends to write its own comedy.
That is true.
There's just too many ridiculous things from history. Confederate submarine being one of them. Put those two words together and you can figure out how that ends.
I think, there's probably something illegal involved, probably.
Well, the whole Confederacy, that would be it. But aside from that, no, it wasn't illegal. It just was a death trap. And
Yeah.
Tell us about the Confederate submarine.
oh, this guy named
Listen.
Hundley, this is like in the Civil War. He's this Confederate engineer, and he invents this death tube, and it's basically a crankshaft. So it's running in the middle of the steel tube. You get 6 guys cramped up in this thing, 5 or 6. The exact designs have kind of been lost, right? But they end up pulling it back up later on, foreshadowing. So anyway, these guys crank it. One guy can see and turns the fin, right? But the way
Yes.
the way it's supposed to work is you put these people in this thing, you seal them in, right? And so they're sealed inside, and there's a pump, right? And when they get in it, it's buoyant, and then the pump pumps air out and pumps water in. So it's never going to go super deep, but nobody's really looking for a submarine at this point, right? So it just kind of sits low and nobody can hit it. So they send it out to test it, on a riverway right by the ocean, right? And Guy Hundley's watching this crew go down, and it just keeps going down, and it's down there for a while. And then people are like, this is pretty good. He's like, nah, they're probably dead. And they pull it back up. It just sunk. And so they pull it back up, and not everyone dies, right? I think 2 people live, but they're not getting back in. So the guy Hundley who invented it just goes around being like, come on, man. Those guys didn't know how to use it right.
Oh,
It's totally safe. It's just they didn't use it right.
Of course.
So Hundley, they're like, we're not getting in there. So Hundley goes, look, if it wasn't safe, would I get in it? So him and a crew get in it and they go down. And this time they all die. And so at this point, even Hunley has died in the Hunley. And it's the third time they send it out. And I don't know who the last crew was, but I mean, if I was the guy, they go, guess what? You're the top in the experimental Navy for the Confederacy. I'd be like, wasn't there like 14 people ahead of me?
That's right.
What happened to them? They're like, don't worry about it. Be a hero.
Yeah, but you could be the submarine commander.
It's the third time they actually get it out there, and it sinks the ship. And yeah, so this was February 18th, 1864. It sinks another ship, right? And it becomes the first submarine ever to sink another ship, unless you count the 2 times before that it had sunk itself. And so the third time, when it sinks the ship, right, it just immediately sinks to the bottom. Everyone dies in it.
Wow.
So even when it succeeded,
One shot.
so you know what happened?
What happened?
Remember, I've told you about this thing, right? I told you how it worked, but I didn't tell you how it blows things up. Okay. So there's this long death tube, right? Well, the weapon is, at the front of that death tube is a long pole. And at the end of that pole is a bomb with a barb on it. So they go out there and the guys are cranking, right? And the guy goes, I see it, crank fast. And and they jam it into the side, right? And then he's like, it's in there, go backwards. And so they go backwards on the crankshaft, right? Turn the propeller. And when it goes, it pulls a string that blows up the bomb. It's straight up out of like, they got to have gotten this from Acme. From Looney Tunes. So when it went back, it sunk, right? Nobody knew what happened to it. So then they find where it is. Like I think it's 100 years later when they discover where it is. Then they come up with this process for bringing it back up. And they bring it up intact. And one of the mysteries was always when they bring it up, the bodies were still in there. And they were all sitting in their position. No panic, no signs of panic, no signs of what would happen, if you're in there. And of course, right. So it's like, why would they still be sitting in position? If you're in a sinking submarine, you try to get up even if you can't, right? Well, it turns out that they didn't do any research and didn't know anything about what happens when something explodes underwater if you are not that far away inside of a metal cylinder. And when it blew up, the blast wave just basically bounced back and forth in there and liquefied these people's insides.
Really?
Yeah. So look, history can be really useful. You can go see the remains of this at the museum in Charleston, South Carolina. But no matter what they tell you, don't get in it. Okay, cool. That's you're sad for the people, but you got to be like, that's pretty.
Yeah, you think you need to invent the torpedo first?
Well, I think they were the first torpedo. I think that's what they were.
Wouldn't they have tried like unmanned test missions?
Apparently not.
Like,
although to
let's
be
just
fair,
try it for the first time.
No, at the end they were unmanned.
At the end,
Yeah, the mission
But not
unmanned
initially.
the mission.
All right, good question. Any questions about comedy or?
So, what you said it was Russian history?
Soviet, yeah, really.
So have you ever played Twilight Struggle?
I have that board game. I've never played it.
Very
It was a gift from a friend,
complicated,
and it seems very complicated. And I have 11-year-old, and before this, he's only been younger than that. So one day we will get it out, but I don't think anytime soon. Is it good?
It is. It's not quite ready for an 11-year-old, but
Not quite. Yeah, no, but the gaming. I don't know. I like games, so one day he'll be forced to sit through it, like when I was a child and was forced to sit through the Cold War.
All right. Speaking of games and game shows, don't you have a game show also?
I do. I have a comedy game show called Perfect Timing.
Oh, what is that?
It's every month not every month now, but it's regular show at Zany's, the lab at Zany's Nashville, and we've changed the format a little bit, but it's 3 comics go up against each other in a game show, and it's like trivia rounds. It can be a variety of things, but it kind of mixes classic game show rounds with performance rounds. So we have stand up. The 3 comics do stand up, right? We do a roast battle to kind of wrap it up. So, and then it's whatever I come up with. Most recently, one of my favorite rounds has been digging deep into people's social media profiles from like 10 years ago and then asking them questions about what they posted on Facebook, like in 2016 or 2018.
I love it. But you find some doozies.
Oh, yeah, because most of the
I'm not
comics-
online.
Yeah, a lot of comics probably aren't right now. But it's like a lot of these comics are like in their like mid to late 20s. And so you're going back and digging something they posted up when they had no idea that the future was real. So they just go, I'll post anything. I've got no awareness or foresight, So that's been really fun.
Wow.
Figuring out really ridiculous things they posted.
And it's called Perfect Timing?
Perfect Timing, that's right. It's at the Lab at Zany's Nashville. It's a regular show there, and I love that venue. Love Zany's, love the people over there.
Yes.
I'm happy to be working with them. And if you guys want to come out, it's a good time. And even one time, we had Dr. Ben warm up the show for us.
Wow.
So, we have celebrity cameos like that. I don't want to
Celebrity
promise
cameos.
that or anything. But, yeah.
Come on, check it out. You never know who you're going to see. Dr. Ben, how did you get into comedy, Professor Ben?
Oh, well, it's I'll make the story as short as possible, but I was living in Russia. I lived in Moscow for about 2 years between 2010 and 2012.
Where a lot of great comedians get their start.
Exactly. Yes, me and Yakov Smirnoff.
That's right.
I love Yakov
Yes,
Smirnoff.
he is
so that wasn't even meant to be disrespectful.
No.
That guy's still
He's
cooks.
hilarious.
So I was living there, and I was on a Fulbright grant, hanging out with a bunch of embassy people and other PhD students at the time. And most of them don't really talk like me. I'm from the country. Nobody in my family went to college. I've got a very, generally an unusual background for people that are at a table like that. But I started telling stories, and it's like something where I'm from. We sit around a fire and tell stories, and people seem to really enjoy them. So I was like, I want to write a sitcom. Because I love sitcoms, my jam. I love sitcoms. So I'm in Moscow. I don't know how to write a sitcom. And I just start reading books about how to do it. And they got different philosophies. But the one thing they said was, all of them said, go do stand-up for a year. Like just do mics or whatever. Because you learn immediate feedback. You learn punch. You kind of learn the kind of art of writing. And so that was 2012 when I read that. When I moved to Big Bear Lake in California, I went down to LA all the time. So I just started doing stand-up in LA. And I finished the script, but I've just been doing stand-up because I love it. It's such a fight, and it's so good for speaking, like learning how to speak to people. I'm a professor. I teach U.S. History 1 and U.S. History 2 at Middle Tennessee State University. Those are the only classes I teach. And you're not supposed to like it, but I love it.
Wow.
But because you got to fight. I have
to get their attention.
I have 150 students a semester, not a single history major, right?
Right.
Aviation students, students in concrete management, right? Students that are doing psychology, sociology.
They're there because they have to be, not because they want to be.
That's the idea. And so what I love about it is, in a way, that's about as close as you can get in a university environment to a comedy club. Because you walk in front of them, right? The difference is at a comedy club, they paid way less and they want to be there. But the point is that you walk up there and they're like, okay, what can you do?
Right.
Right? What can you do? Nobody goes, oh, Ben Sawyer, we heard that guy on Fallon. Right? I've got to walk in front of a comedy club audience, and I've got to prove that they made the right choice to come see me. And same thing, I've got to not just prove me, but I've got to prove that history matters to a bunch of people whose average age is about 19 years old. They became aware they existed, in the last 5 years. And since then, they've mostly been trying to eat pizza. Right? So why would they care what happens 200 years ago? So I've got to try to make that case to them. And as it turns out, it's really useful to study history for a lot of things right now. I mean, even if you don't, they think it's a class, they think it's a series of dates. And that's because our education system is failing people. That you pass an AP test by memorizing a bunch of dates. But what are the dates do? I mean, there's different calendars, right? There's multiple calendars one could use. So why would memorizing this series of a month, a day, and a year matter? It doesn't. If I gave you a list, if you guys watch the Avengers movies, it should be called "Will It Ever End Game?" It was way too long. But if you watch that, and at the end I ask you about Iron Man, I ask you about Hulk, I ask you about these people, right? You spend about 2.5 hours watching that movie, and you could tell me about their character, right? But if instead of that, I just handed you a sheet of every character in there and made you memorize every single one of their characteristics, where they were from, their backstory, what their conflict was, could you do that after just sitting there and staring at this paper? And if you could, would you have cared?
Yeah.
You wouldn't. So history is a story, and it turns out, there are lots of good things we could use, like reading the Constitution. It's very valuable. It will blow your mind if you read. Anybody listening right now, just go sit down and read the Constitution. It's not very long. And then look around at the world and ask yourself, has anybody read it lately? And if they have, was it to do the opposite?
Mhm.
You know, there's reasons why the president's powers are checked. It comes out of a generational experience of people who were abused by someone with too much power. And they tried to pass on this wisdom to next generations because they're trying to do what we're all trying to do, right? Raise our children. What's the first thing we want to do? Make them not have to go through all the hard stuff that we went through, right?
Mhm.
When you understand that the Constitution is not written by like gods or like bigger than us, it's written by people who had a hard time of it with a king that had too much power and disrespected them, and they tried to pass us something that could balance it out to make sure that didn't happen again. Then suddenly it's not just like, oh, the Constitution is like, do we have to memorize it? No, you go, all right, this is a love letter from people who left this behind to save us from problems. And once you realize that, it's so much more meaningful than just like the system of government. The 10 Amendments, right? I can walk you through the 10 Amendments and every point tell you everything in there, how that happened to the people who pitched those out, right? Who put those out there. And so it's this document. And when you know it, you're grateful. You're so grateful because what happens when power gets too concentrated? I mean, and what does power do to people? Right? Story of King Solomon from the Bible.
Corrupts them.
Yeah. Story of Lord of the Rings. You can find it everywhere. We know this. And so when you realize that the idea is to check power, it just means it's something different, right? And I feel like there's a sense of gratitude to that past generation for trying to do it for us. And then you feel like you should do it. We don't have to get on a bus and ride through the South just to end segregation. Diane Nash, right down here in Nashville, 1961, had a phone call with John Siegenthaler, who was one of the Attorney General's assistants at the time. They had gone through the South to challenge segregation. And the white supremacists had rounded them up, driven them to the state line of Tennessee and dropped them off. Basically, you come back, you'll die. They just came back to Nashville, got more people, and were ready to go. Siegenthaler calls her and says, you can't go down there. They'll kill you. And she says, we're going. He says, you can't go down there. You don't understand. And he's a man talking to a college student at Fisk University. And he says, you don't understand. They'll kill you. And she says, I know. We all made our last will and testament last night. We're going back. Can't let violence beat nonviolence. And we don't have to do that because they did.
Yeah.
So a lot of gratitude to be had and a lot of knowledge to be gained and a lot of wisdom that, you know, from other people's suffering that if we inherited it, we didn't earn it, be good stewards to it.
Hi, I'm Logan from Biloxi, Mississippi. What is the difference between a man and a dog? A man wears trousers, but a dog pants.
Now, just switching gears a little, were you more nervous to lecture for the first time or do the stand-up for the first time? Do you remember both?
I think I am unfortunately and naively blindly confident when it comes to anything like that.
Okay.
Which just makes you worse at it when you first start. So, I don't know. I think lecturing was something that I eased into. I wanted to be a high school teacher. That was my original goal. And I failed at that. So I went on to be a college professor. So I always wanted to teach. I just, university, I just decided to get my master's to go back to teach in high school. And then a professor of mine told me that, look, you got a gift for this. If you want to have more livelihood, a better livelihood, like in terms of your financial possibilities. Keep in mind, this was like 25 years ago. This part didn't pan out. But he was like, go on, and you've got the talent for it. So I think I always wanted to do it. I coached soccer when I was in high school. I coached the middle school team. I loved working with young people. And so for me, the comedy, I was overconfident because I thought I was good because people laughed at me as a professor. When you think about it, you go, wait a second. Those people are locked in the room with you, and they're not comparing you. Like they weren't comparing me to Bill Burr. They were comparing me to like 3 other people that had given up on life. Right? And then in 1973,
So you were hilarious.
Yeah, no, it's a relative thing. And so it turns out you have to learn how to be really funny. And maybe if you got into the habit of being professor funny, you're going to need to work yourself out of it if you ever want to be really funny.
And you mentioned telling stories in Russia. Is that kind of your comedy style for stand-up? Are you a storyteller or?
I'm not as much as I probably should be. I think for comedy, for me, it's like I like writing things that make me laugh. And a lot of times they're just dumb. So like I've got the history storyteller in me that doesn't like a stand-up comedy stage is always hard because people want you need to be out there They need to be laughing, right?
8 laughs a minute or
I could do storytelling. The longest I've done before is like 30 minutes, right? So I've never been at a point where I'm doing an hour or even 30 minutes regularly, right? You need that space to do a story. If you're doing 10, 12, 15, 20, right? You're up there and they're just like, make me laugh, monkey, make me laugh.
Right.
And so, you
just got to hit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's just hard because you got to deal with things like, I want to tell jokes about being a historian, a history professor, right? And this is the thing you understand, right? When you walk up there and you start saying that stuff, I think you probably don't because you're immediately useful to people, right?
I don't know about
With me, I think it's like you got to overcome the fact that you go, I'm a history professor, and people go, oh, brother, this guy thinks he knows more than me, right? And I've never fixed anybody's bones before, so there's like no one in the crowd's grateful to me, right? So they're just like, oh, this guy thinks you know. So you got to figure out a way to work around that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so I wrote a joke I still tell, which is, I've got a Southern accent. I'm a history professor, but I've got a Southern accent. And when I go out west to California, people hear my accent and wonder if I'm smart enough to be a history professor. And I don't get mad. I'm just amazed that people still think you've got to be smart to be a professor. And that was the way I kind of eased with it. It's a misdirect, obviously. But overall, I think it's like the storytelling stuff works for me better in different formats. And I probably need to produce one for myself instead of just going on other people's shows and telling long stories. But yeah, my podcast, The Road to Now, which I do with Bob Crawford from the Avett Brothers, we just talk to other people who are smarter than us, which is why I immediately fell into asking you guys questions in the first segment of the show. Because I was like, smart people, talk to them.
Right. I love it. And the sitcom, how'd the sitcom come along?
It's finished. I think it's legitimately funny. I'm not sure, though, because I do like 6 or 7 things that are running. And it's very hard for me to want to drop into asking people favors to get a sitcom read that statistically can't actually be as good as I think it is because it's the first one I wrote. So I wrote it. I loved it when I wrote it. When I went back to it a couple of years ago, I could imagine the people I was writing it. It was flowing out of my head. The characters were talking in my head, and I was just writing it down, and I was cracking up as I was listening to them talk. So I loved the process, but I don't know. Okay. I don't think you'll be tuning into NBC to see it anytime soon. But I do deeply love it.
Maybe like UPN.
Maybe like a YouTube channel that's subsidized by some charity that helps out professors who can't quite wrap their heads around how bad they are at it. So,
well, if you need a couple actors, got some characters here. Mr. Adam, have you ever thought of doing stand-up comedy? You're a funny, witty guy.
Yeah, I think, like he said, I mean, like translating that, I don't know. It's like, I'm a funny guy, but it's like, at work or, church or anywhere else, it's like, these are people I know and I have a lot of material to work with, right? So like in your class, probably you get to know some of the students and that helps a little bit. But when you're on stage, it's like, you just have to be funny. Maybe I could do it. I don't know. I've never really thought about it, honestly.
We'll have you out to open
I'm actually kind of a shy guy. So.
Don't do it. Don't do it. Craig Ferguson said it best. I think it's true. He said it of stand-up comedy. It's true of that. It's also true of getting a PhD in history. The only reason to do it is because you can't not do it. Like
you're driven to do it.
You have to do it. That's the only reason.
Because I feel like 30 minutes on stage at a comedy venue is an eternity. It would feel like.
Depends on how it's going.
Yeah. Well, you probably just got to go up there and bomb a little bit anyway, right? Like that just gets it out of your system.
You start with like an open mic.
Yeah.
Do like a 4-minute set and
work your way up, like building the muscles, kind of.
Right.
Doing open mics where when people in the audience laugh, it's mostly comics. So when they laugh, it might be because that was the worst joke of all time. You're not quite sure because they laughed when you fail to.
Right. Yeah. It's hard to tell.
See, I always thought like voice acting would be more fun because it's like you get to do stuff and you get a chance to screw it up and edit it. And I do a lot of voices and impressions. I do impressions of just about everybody. But there's also a big translation of doing that.
Do an impression for us.
Oh, see, I don't do it on command. I'm like
who's your best?
Spider-Man. I can't do it on command.
Okay.
Fine. But
do you do any impressions in stand-up?
Do I do any impressions? I don't really do any impressions in stand-up.
Okay.
I don't think. I do accent of this Russian professor that I had.
Oh, okay.
He's from Caucasus Mountains, and he always talked about how love was amazing. But if the damn Cossacks came for him, he would defend his family. He would get automatic gun machine and fight to keep his family safe. He would then imaginarily mow down the entire class with a automatic gun machine, and then snap back out of it and be like, so love is beautiful. It is springtime. Move on.
It's accents are easy because you just do stereotype. It's great.
Knowing accent is actually very useful. If you can do accent, you can learn language better because you can understand what noises other person makes in native language.
Ah,
Yeah. And the cadence, right? The way it goes up and down.
I like it.
You should say something in Korean.
Do it.
Like
do
if
it,
you say
do it.
"nazdarovia" in Russian, which
Nazdarovia.
is grammatically not correct.
It's not bad. It's true.
bad.
"Nazdarovia." What do you say in Korean?
It depends. What does Nostrovia mean?
It's like when you
Cheers.
cheers.
Oh, cheers.
When you cheers.
That's true.
Cool.
Okay, so we'll ask the Russian expert. How do you say like a cheers to lift your glass?
Astrovia.
Ah.
Yeah.
And then in Korean, it's more like John.
Jan to close friends, but
Jan to close-
kambe.
Oh.
Oh.
John in Korean.
John.
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 Okay.
There we go. That's good. You said John to me. Every other Korean's ever said Gambe, which lets me know where we stand.
Jan is specifically for friends. You wouldn't say that in front of your coworkers. Kambe, if it was your friends.
Is there like a respectful, like the respectful version of language? Like in Russian, you there is like
More formal.
Ty and then vui, and like the vui form is for someone that you like is a professional person or someone older than you, right? Like if like здравствуйте, which means like greetings, right? If it's someone formal, you say здравствуйте, but if it is a friend, you say здравствуй.
Yeah, more
It
casual.
sounds more
relaxed,
casual.
Not
I don't know what you
respectful,
just
like for
said,
an elder.
Greetings,
There is
like
for
здравствуйте.
Korean also.
Banmal and jodanmal.
And a lot of languages have that. English, not as much, a little bit, but
We just say ma'am and sir where I'm from.
that's right.
That's how you
That's
let them
right.
know.
Yeah, when you were in California, was it Rodeo Drive?
Rodeo drive.
Rodeo.
You just got to get down on the, you got to take the 5 down to the 10.
Yeah, in California, they always say the before the highway.
Yeah, I still do that sometimes for any big like interstates or freeways, as we call them.
They're also freaked out by exit numbers. My wife is still because they never had numbers, right? Like, you know how everywhere else in America works? It's perfectly reasonable.
We have mile
system?
markers, but you know the street.
Yeah. Then you get off on the 5, and I'm like, "What's the exit?" She's like, "The 5." And I'm like, "Exit 5." She's like, "No, we don't do that." My wife.
No, you go to Rosecrans.
The 5.
We don't do it.
The 5. All right. All right, folks. Thanks for hanging with Dr. Ben and friends from the heart of Music City, where the laughs are loud, the history's deep, and the music still jamming. We love celebrating healthcare heroes and comic pros with you. Remember, we can be serious in surgery, but some of us are seriously funny. All right. If you love today's episode celebrating comics and healthcare heroes, join Dr. Ben's team and hit that subscribe button. All right. Does it make a fart noise? Let us know. Your word of mouth is our best support.
There's
Tell a
only one way to find out.
That's right.
Let us know because it needs to come in and see Dr. Ben about that.
And take the fertilizer test. All right. Your word of mouth is our best support. Tell a friend, tell your healthcare hero, your comic, if you know one. We'd love to hear from you and your friends. Drop your favorite joke, dad joke, and we will potentially air it online. We can't wait to feature you in our next episode. I want to thank our stellar guest today. Thank you, Professor Ben Sawyer, hilarious history buff and comedy machine. Where can our listeners find you, Dr. Ben?
Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Ben. Real Dr. Ben, we'll call you that. Well, if you want to see my comedy, you can go to my comedy website, sawyercomedy.com, where I list my show dates. Again, I got perfect timing at the lab at Zany's. It's one of my favorite things I do right here in Nashville. And if you're interested in the history side, my podcast is called The Road to Now. I co-host it with Bob Crawford of the band The Avett Brothers. We're about to celebrate our 10-year anniversary, or may have by the time this airs, actually. And so check us out. We're on Sirius XM weekends on channel 124, POTUS, the nonpartisan talk channel, which I'm very proud of. And so that's where you can find me.
Love it. Thanks for being here. And Adam, our certified surgical first assistant and healthcare hero, thanks for being here. Anything for the listeners to scrub out? You have a podcast also, or where can...
I have a couple podcasts I do. I guess I can plug the main one I do with a bunch of friends. It's a community-run podcast. It's called Vassals of Kingsgrave. It's sort of an offshoot. We used to do like Game of Thrones, reviews, and we sort of just do everything kind of pop culture now.
Love it.
So book reviews, movies, that sort of stuff.
All right. Well, I'm grateful for you both. Real heroes don't just wear white coats. They guest on comedy podcasts. your official mental health MVPs. All right, folks, see you next week when I, Dr. Ben, and my
Friends.
help you put more med in your comedy. Take care, y'all.